Hi, I'm Fox with Foxio Games, and this is Dark Souls for the PC, also available on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Originally released in 2011, Dark Souls is the spiritual successor to the critically acclaimed Demon Souls, which was a PlayStation 3 exclusive. But does Dark Souls do justice to the Souls franchise, and is it still worth playing today? Let's find out. But before we begin, I face a very unique and difficult challenge. While the PS3 and Xbox 360 releases of the game are what they are, the PC release is a lot more complicated, and that's the one I'll be focusing on. The PC version released in a terrible state. While it was fully playable without any significant bugs or glitches, for the most part, it had a locked internal rendering resolution of 1024 by 720, locked 30 frames per second, and virtually no graphics options to speak of. On top of all of that, it was horribly unoptimized, requiring a gaming PC far more powerful than it should have to run it properly. So, the issue that complicates this review is that I don't play that version of Dark Souls on my PC. Yes, that's right. I play the DSFix modded version, which offers true rendering resolutions up to 4K or higher, 60 frames per second or even higher, and numerous additional graphics options not available in the vanilla version of the game. DSFix is a mod created by an individual not affiliated with the game or the publisher, so it's completely unofficial. Normally I don't factor in unofficial mods like that, but I can't pretend that the base Dark Souls is my experience, because it's not. I've been playing Dark Souls on PC with the DSFix mod for years now, and that's the experience that I enjoy. I'll try to balance this review by mentioning the issues with the base PC version, as well as address some of the technical issues that plague the console versions as well. This should provide a happy balance during the review, and I wanted you to be aware of that ahead of time. A link to the DSFix mod is located in the video description. Anyway, let's address the PC port in a little more detail. As I just mentioned, the game released in an abysmal state. The only good thing I could say about it is that it works. Crashes are rare, and I was only aware of one game-breaking bug that has since been patched out, not to mention it was uncommonly encountered. Regardless of the fact that it runs, Dark Souls' PC release state was, and still is, completely unacceptable. An incredibly low internal rendering resolution, a locked 30 frames per second, and virtually no graphics options. On top of all of that, as I mentioned earlier, the game was so poorly optimized that it ran pretty terribly even on moderately powerful hardware, despite looking terrible and suffering from very low resolution textures and a low frame rate. However, that isn't the end of the story, and thank goodness. A private individual going by the online handle Durante created a mod for Dark Souls named DSFix. This mod went through various iterations and modifications, but it didn't take long before it allowed you to play Dark Souls at any true resolution of your choosing, 60 FPS or even higher, and you could enable a variety of graphics options, including SSAO and anti-aliasing. You're also able to replace the in-game textures with user-created textures, and the community has made available a host of high-resolution textures for nearly everything in the game. Thanks to DSFix and the modding community, Dark Souls on the PC looks vastly superior to the base release of the game, and it surpasses the console versions by leaps and bounds. While I still blame FromSoft for one of the worst functional PC ports in recent history, at the end of the day, I am able to enjoy Dark Souls on PC with amazing graphics and solid performance, so I'm happy with that as it stands. Unfortunately, there are still a few issues. The DSFix mod does not and cannot fix the poor optimization, so many gamers with decent gaming hardware may find the game doesn't perform to their expectations. A few of the texture mods can cause stutter in the game, although you can easily avoid those. Two of the bigger issues involve the use of the frame rate modifier and going above 30 frames per second. At 60 FPS or higher, there are two things to be aware of. First, you must wait a few seconds after sitting at a bonfire before you can reverse your hollowing. Otherwise, your character can get stuck at the bonfire and be unable to get up, requiring you to force close the game. Secondly, there are a couple delicate jumps in the game that you'll miss if you try them with the 60 FPS mod enabled. The good news is that you can revert the frame rate to 30 by hitting an in-game hotkey and then revert it back again to 60. I only have to do this in 2 places in the entire game, so it's not a big deal to me. These are minor issues to deal with in order to enjoy the benefits of the better visuals. Some people complain that they fall through the floor when sliding down ladders, but it has never happened to me, so I don't know what that's about. Please note that I'm actually running the game at 72 frames per second because of my monitor. The game's physics will break down much beyond 60 frames per second, so 72 frames per second is half of my monitor's 144 Hz and a happy balance for me. Most monitors run at 60 Hz, so there's no need to go above 60 frames per second. Besides, in many areas of the game, your frame rate will drop no matter how powerful your hardware is. This is running on a 6GB GTX 980 Ti with an Intel Core i7-4790K and 16GB of system memory, and it still drops into the 30s at times. Also note that when the frame rate drops, neither the CPU nor the graphics card are near full load, which means the game simply isn't working the way it should. I shouldn't have 50% of my graphics card processing power sitting unused with frame rate drops like these. As for the controls, you'll definitely want a controller here. Yes, it's possible to play it with a mouse and keyboard. Heck, the controls are set up by default to even play with keyboard only, no mouse. While you can play with mouse and keyboard or keyboard only, I really don't recommend it. The game was intended to be played with a controller, and it's much better that way. The camera movement with the mouse is really jittery and hard to control. It's just outright terrible. Thankfully, there's a mod you can use in conjunction with DSFix called DSFix that smooths out the mouse controls and makes it feel far more natural. There's a link to the mod in the video description. You can rebind keys as well, but trust me, just use a controller. Unfortunately, the game only supports X input by default, so if you don't have an Xbox 360 or Xbox One controller, you'll have to use an X input emulator to get other gamepads to work. I've linked one of those below as well. When the game released, it used Games for Windows Live for online connectivity. In fact, it was required to even save your game, although you could circumvent going online by creating a local profile. Games for Windows Live is dead now, thank goodness, but when it was required by Dark Souls, it was often a miserable experience. Not only were summons and invasions really spotty, failing constantly over and over again, but the Games for Windows Live client would often act up. Sometimes you'd boot the game up and everything would just run fine. Other times you'd start the game and Games for Windows Live would complain that it can't connect. Nothing you do would fix the problem, and the servers were up and running. There was even a website to test that. So you'd ultimately have to either erase your profile and re-download it, or you'd have to completely uninstall Games for Windows Live entirely, then reinstall it. I had to do this at least a couple dozen times. It was really annoying, and this is why Games for Windows Live was considered a bane on PC gaming. Ultimately, it was little more than a giant hassle and Microsoft's failed attempt to monetize online PC gaming. Thankfully, From Software actually patched the game to remove the Games for Windows Live component entirely, and now it simply works natively through Steam, sometimes referred to as Steamworks. Unfortunately, even after a few patches to fix some really obvious bugs in the system, it's still a bit of a mess. Invasions and summons still fail all the time, and many summon signs and invasions will introduce players as bracket unknown bracket. They haven't worked out a system to make the Dark Souls character naming scheme jive with Steam's far more permissive naming scheme, which allows players to use characters and symbols that Dark Souls doesn't allow. This is what is creating most of the trouble. There's a mod to help you with connecting to other players, but ultimately this shouldn't be necessary at this point. From Software specifically patched the game to fix this issue, and they didn't fix it. That's just unfortunate because the multiplayer is such a big part of the game, but we'll discuss more about that later. Alright, let's move on from discussing technical issues with the port, shall we? Starting to get depressing, to be honest. On to the graphics. Let me address all versions of the game here, including unmodded and modded PC versions. Firstly, the console versions of the game are what they are. There are no mods there, obviously. For the time, both PS3 and Xbox 360's visuals were acceptable, and the art direction really helped to mask some of the less than stellar textures. Sadly, both console versions of the game can suffer from extreme blurriness and low-resolution textures, not to mention quite a few frame rate drops. Who can forget the infamous Blight Town, where the true Blight isn't the poisonous swamp, it's the frame rate slowdown. There's no getting around the fact that this area of the game drops to unacceptably low levels of performance, so bad that you might even see frames in the single digits. Yikes, that's pretty bad. Thankfully, the games get relatively close to 30 frames per second most of the time, and rarely do frame rate drips dramatically affect your gameplay, other than being a constant subpar 30 FPS at best. In an action game requiring such precise timing, 30 FPS just isn't enough. I know, some of you hate this discussion and it really gets on your nerves. I get that. I see it in the comments section all the time. I just can't deny who I am, and I can't deny reality. I will always prefer higher frame rates, not only for the visual fidelity, but also for the better controls and tighter response times. It's simply a fact. Higher frame rates equal better control. As for the unmodded PC version, it's really not much better than the consoles. It has some anti-aliasing, but that doesn't make up for the low rendering resolution and 30 FPS lock. It does generally perform better, even in Blighttown, but it still suffers from unnecessary frame rate drops that are no doubt due to the bad optimization. It's a terrible port, graphically speaking. But thank goodness we have DSFix. Once you get this baby modded up and add some nice HD textures, you'll be seeing a whole new game. It's visually better in nearly every way. The textures are higher resolution and much sharper, the vegetation and character models look far better, and the higher resolution eliminates the blurriness of the consoles. At 1920 by 1080, 60 frames per second, in with the HD texture pack installed, Dark Souls on PC is a pretty beautiful experience, for the most part. The game has a variety of locales, from the prison-like northern undead asylum, to the dark forests of Darkroot Garden, to the lava lakes of Lost Izalith. There's quite a lot of variety here. Each new area you encounter is a visual treat, even on the lackluster console versions. Enemies in each area generally match the theme of that location, and the models are pretty detailed. Speaking of detailed models, just look at the gear in this game. Whether it's your weapon, your shield, or your armor, it's unbelievable how much love and care was put into designing each piece of equipment in Dark Souls. Shields have battle scars and scrapes. The armor pieces have a ton of little things you normally never see in games, and many of the textures include interesting details that are easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Just like its predecessor Demon Souls, Dark Souls is a game where it's worth stopping to smell the roses. It may not be a cheery game, but it is beautiful in its own dark and dreary way. When you encounter this deceased dragon for the first time, it's quite a sight. There are a lot of pretty stunning visuals in the game, so much so that they sometimes make up for the console's lack of visual quality. It's best to play this game on a good PC, since it's much easier to see these small yet significant details, but you can still enjoy the visuals on the consoles if that's all you've got. Enemy and boss designs are pretty awesome, and a lot of attention was put into designing them, just like the armor and the rest of the gear. With very few exceptions, they all look like stellar pieces of dark fantasy art. You won't see any generic goblins or trolls here. Well, the skeletons aren't the most amazing designs in the game, but they're good enough. I mean, there's only so much you can do with just bones, and they've done more than enough, especially these big dudes. Oh gosh, these big dudes are so freaky. Just look at those eyes. Those eyes in the darkness could give a man nightmares. The music in Dark Souls is equally incredible. While most of the game features no music at all, the tracks that do exist are almost all superb. From bombastic battle music to hauntingly sad, when you do hear music, it's really good. Very few of the songs are actually worth listening to outside of the game, but there are definitely a few that people have become attached to. You can find remixes and covers for these songs all over YouTube. I won't play it here, but the song for the final encounter in the game really caught me off guard, and in a good way. Some of the songs in the game even have a tempo and a beat that seems to portray the boss that you're fighting. It's hard to explain, but play the game and pay attention to the music and I think you'll see what I mean. While many games feature songs that are easily interchangeable from one battle to the next, some of the songs in Dark Souls are very obviously uniquely tailored to that specific fight. It's really cool, and when you first notice it, you can't help but be impressed. While I believe that Demon Souls has the best singular song in the entire Souls series, which is of course the Maiden Estrella theme, Dark Souls has the best overall soundtrack in my opinion. Demon Souls music was impressive, but Dark Souls is far more so. As for the sound engineering, I can happily report that From Software has obviously improved their game here by leaps and bounds. Compared to the audio balance issues of Demon Souls, Dark Souls balance is nearly perfect at all times. Whether you're listening to the background sounds of the various locales or you're engaged in frenetic combat, every sound of the game is appropriate to the setting and situation. A few sounds are a bit too loud, like the fire from the Hellkite Drake, but that's not a big issue. The voice acting is once again great. Not a single line of dialogue pulled me out of the experience. They all help to draw me into the world of Dark Souls. They even feature one of my favorite voice actresses, Charlie Cameron. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. She voices Rhea of Thorland.
You are undead as well? Then we've no time to fraternize. I have my mission and you no doubt have yours.
I really enjoyed hearing the various characters voice their lines, as they all seem to put some real heart and soul into it. Get it? Soul? Dark Souls? Okay, well that wasn't that clever. Anyway, moving on. The story in Dark Souls is a little more prevalent than the sparsity of story in Demon Souls. But just like Demon Souls, Dark Souls intentionally refuses to reveal everything to you and leaves a lot unknown. Fans of the game have speculated endlessly on the full extent of the characters, places, and lore of the game, but ultimately, we will never know everything. Like the previous game, much of the lore and story is gained not just through dialogue, but also through item descriptions and the details in the environments themselves. Much of it will be left to you to interpret, and you'll find many different interpretations in various lore videos available on YouTube. Go check out a few after you finish your first playthrough and you'll see what I mean. I'm not going to show the cutscene here because I don't like copyright claims on my videos, but Dark Souls opens by explaining a brief history of the world of Lordran. Basically, there were dragons, and then the dragons died thanks to the betrayal of a scaleless dragon. There are some human-like gods or something. There's an age of fire, and some other stuff. It's surprisingly deep for the short bit that is there, but it's best to experience it for yourself. The most important thing to note is that the curse of the undead is enveloping the land, turning people into hollows, undead humans who have lost their way. Many of these hollows are sent to the Northern Undead Asylum as a sort of prison, and that's where you begin the game. After creating your character, you'll find yourself locked in a cell in the asylum. Your escape begins when a knight drops a corpse into your cell, containing the key to escape. After speaking to this knight, he tells you of a prophecy, and you leave the asylum in pursuit of your quest. And one thing I've always wondered is, why does he have to drop the corpse with the key, instead of just the key? Whatever. If you don't pay close attention, you're likely to miss most of the important details of the story. Very rarely is anything ever clearly spelled out for you. It's really up to you to glean the few details and tidbits that you can from the various characters, items, and environments in the game. Similarly to Demon Souls, if you don't like games that leave a lot of unanswered questions, you're going to be frustrated by the presentation. If you don't mind games that leave a lot to the imagination, then you might enjoy joining the community and theorizing about the game and its various characters and events. For example, what is this pendant you can choose at the start of the game? Seriously, it doesn't seem to do anything. It even says that much. You can trade it with a certain character for a rather trivial item, but surely it must have some other purpose. Why else would it be here? Oh, nice, Miyazaki. Nice. It literally had no purpose, just like he told us. As for the game's ending, I have to say that I was a bit disappointed. There's more than one ending, but none of the endings really made a whole lot of sense to me, and I found the lack of exposition here crossed my frustration threshold just a little bit. Demon Souls rewarded you differently based on how you ended the game, providing you with something to make use of in subsequent New Game Plus playthroughs, but Dark Souls does no such thing. Oh, and I forgot to mention in my Demon Souls review that after you complete the game, you can keep playing in New Game Plus, where a modifier increases the health and damage of enemies and bosses. The same thing occurs with Dark Souls 2. Unfortunately, virtually nothing else about the game changes. If I compared the stories and lore of Demon Souls and Dark Souls, which would I say I liked better? Well, that's a pretty easy call for me. It's definitely Dark Souls on both accounts. It's a bit unfair though, as Demon Souls was the first of its kind, so From Software used all that experience while creating Dark Souls, and it really shows. But what about the gameplay? I'm happy to report that just like Demon Souls, Dark Souls has a wide variety of options here. Both games feature very similar third-person action RPG combat with an emphasis on very careful, strategic moves. Most players will probably rely very heavily on their shield for at least their first playthrough. Moving slowly and cautiously through the areas with your shield held up is not a bad idea. You can once again equip several pieces of armor, 2 rings, and 2 weapons or shields per hand. You can quickly switch your right or left hand weapon by hitting either right or left on the D-pad, and pressing down cycles through a few quick use slots for easy access to items in the heat of battle. You'll be relieved to hear that Dark Souls does away with the item burden mechanic, meaning that you never have to worry about the total weight of all items you're holding. You can carry as much as you want. Of course, consumables will only stack to 99, at which point you can't pick up any more. Rather than storing your items at a person like you did in Demon Souls, you now have the purchasable bottomless box, which you can access at any bonfire. Not only is it more convenient, but gone is the possibility of accidentally attacking Stockpile Thomas and destroying your ability to get your items back. Speaking of bonfires, let's talk about those. Demon Souls featured 1 archstone per area that always teleported you back to the Nexus, your central hub area. Dark Souls changes things up quite a bit. After leaving the Northern Undead Asylum, you land in Firelink Shrine, the game's rough equivalent of the Nexus. Firelink Shrine is not a teleportation hub, it's a physical location that you can travel to and leave at will. This is where many of the game's NPCs will change location to after you encounter them, so it does serve a central purpose in the game. Instead of teleporting from archstones, you can rest at bonfires, each one establishing your new spawn point. Bonfires allow you to perform a variety of functions, some requiring that you find or purchase an item to unlock that ability. You can reverse your hollowing, more on that later, repair and upgrade gear, level up, and access the bottomless box. Resting at a bonfire restores your health and Estus, but it also revives the enemies in the area. In each new area you explore, the relief of finding a bonfire is palpable. Sometimes you stumble upon one just in time, having run out of Estus and finding yourself low on health. It's a huge relief when you do. While Demon Souls did have an NPC who could assist you during a boss battle, Dark Souls takes this concept to a whole new level, providing a variety of summonable NPC characters to help you during your adventure. There are quite a few, and you can even summon 2 NPCs for some fights. This is a really cool element, as it allows players who are struggling with the boss fights to summon help even if no players are available. This will maintain at least a small resemblance of the multiplayer summoning system, even after the servers are long gone. Oh, and when I was talking about being low on health earlier and finding a bonfire, check this out. This was not staged. This is literally how the boss fight ended for me. I was completely out of Estus and had only a fraction of my health bar left. I had to dodge at least 3 attacks to land 4 attacks on the boss, knowing that the next hit on me would spell certain death. Let me just say that moments like these in Dark Souls really get your heart racing. Now, some deaths will feel kinda cheap. I'm not a fan of developers putting in beginner's traps designed solely for the purpose of killing new players. I don't mean difficult segments of the game, that's fine. What I mean is those moments specifically designed to catch virtually every new player off guard and instantly kill them. There's a great example I could show you, but I'd rather you discover it for yourself and experience the natural frustration that follows. As for Estus, this is another big departure from Demon Souls. Gone is the reliance on consumable healing items, and instead, there's Estus, a refillable drink resource that heals you according to its current reinforcement level. Each reinforcement of the Estus requires a special item and increases the total health healed per use. The Estus has a limited number of uses depending on whether you've used a humanity to kindle the bonfire. You begin with 5 Estus, but a kindled bonfire brings you up to 10. There may be methods of getting higher amounts of Estus, but you can discover those for yourself. Regardless, Estus is ultimately limited. There are no 99 heals here, people. The resource for kindling bonfires is known as humanity, and it can be obtained from killing a certain number of enemies, from consumable items you locate in the game, or from killing a hostile player that invaded you, or that you invade. Yes, Dark Souls has a very similar online multiplayer component to Demon Souls, complete with player messages, player ghosts, bloodstains showing how other players have died, and summons and invasions. This time, you don't have soul form and body form, you have your base hallowed form and a reverse hallowed form, which we commonly refer to as human form. In hallowed form, you look grossly undead and cannot summon other players into your world to assist you. But you are also immune to invasions from other players. If you reverse your hallowing, you look a lot more human, and you can now summon other players into your world. Conversely, you're also subject to hostile invaders. And big improvement on Demon Souls is that regardless of what form you're in, you can always drop your summon sign for other players to see. The tendency system that I hated in Demon Souls has now been kind of replaced with a covenant system, and it's totally different. You can join one of a number of different covenants, but you can only be in one at a time. Each covenant serves a different function, such as the Dark Wraiths, who focus on invading players for PvP, the Way of White ostensibly makes it easier to find co-op, or the Sunlight Covenant for special miracles like Lightning Spear. While the covenants do add a lot to the game, not all of them are really all that useful. To be honest, the Way of White and Princess Guard are mostly pointless, especially the Way of White. Other covenants have very niche value, such as the Gravelord Covenant providing an awesome weapon and allowing you to infest other players' worlds with unique red phantom NPCs. Unfortunately, you don't see what is actually happening to these other players or really even know when it's happening, so that sucks. Because you need to be in a certain covenant to use certain spells, it can be frustrating if you want to use 2 different spells bound to 2 different covenants. You simply won't have access to both at the same time. Many of the covenants will provide you with spells, weapons, or armor based on your rank. Ranking up in covenants is mostly done by providing the covenant leader with an item, usually obtained by killing other players. The Dark Wraith Covenant gives you a hand weapon that allows you to steal other players' humanity, so I guess that's kinda cool. Speaking of humanity, you maintain a soft stock of the resource on your character. If you die, all of your souls fall to the ground just like in Demon Souls, but so too does your humanity. You could have a ton of souls and dozens of humanity fall to the ground when you die, only to lose them all if you die back en route to your bloodstain. When you die, you revert to hollow form. Your health bar does not get cut in half this time, thank goodness, but there is a curse debuff in the game that's really nasty and does reduce your total health. Oh great, now I'm cursed. My health is at half and I can't reverse hallowing to summon other players. I'm stuck in this dungeon and I don't have a way to cure it down here. Getting cursed sucks. Oh, nice, a ring that resists curse. I'm so glad I found this after I no longer need it. Anyway, like Demon Souls, Dark Souls uses a lock-on system, allowing you to maintain focus on a single enemy. It works best when you're facing 1 or 2 enemies. If you're facing multiple enemies, you want them all on one side of you. Once you're surrounded by enemies, the lock-on can be a bit spotty, as shifting your target can make the camera jump all over the place. Generally, the lock-on works great, but it doesn't seem to lock on to enemies who are inside a room if you're outside of it. Even if you can see them standing right in front of you, you gotta go into the room for it to work. Whatever. Rather than warping from place to place like in Demon Souls, Dark Souls has you traveling seamlessly throughout the land of Lordran. Nearly every area in the game connects to at least one other area, and there are lots of shortcuts to open up to save you time. Eventually, there is a way to warp to a select few spots, but it's not available for a while. You might think that running from one area to the next would get tiresome, but it rarely does. Yeah, if you gotta run all the way back somewhere to upgrade a weapon, repair, or buy something, yeah, that can be a bit annoying. But generally, traveling is pretty well balanced and really helps to cement your knowledge of how the land of Lordran fits together. The map is masterfully designed, and nearly all of it makes sense. The game has a lot of verticality to it, making elevation an even more important factor than it was in the past. The entire trip to the Blighttown Swamp is a giant vertical scaffolding structure in which you continuously try to safely make your way down to the bottom. There's also another area that does something similar to this. So, what's the verdict? For those of you who know me, it should be no surprise that I absolutely love Dark Souls. It's probably my favorite game of all time. Given that I've been playing games for nearly 30 years on all sorts of platforms, I think that's a very powerful statement. Dark Souls is a deeply engaging, meaningful experience for me. You get a real sense of accomplishment and satisfaction when you make it through an area that you've died in many times, or finally defeat a boss after a half dozen attempts. The difficulty curve feels just right most of the time, with only a few exceptions. Nearly every boss presents at least one unique challenge or quirk to change things up, and as you push through the game, you will find several points in which the difficulty is ramped up just enough to destroy any sense of comfort you might have developed. I love the detail put into the armor and weapon models, and enemy and NPC models are nothing short of amazing too. There's so much awesomeness to the designs in this game, it's hard not to stop and admire them from time to time. I will say though that occasionally, some pieces of gear will look just a bit odd, like some armor sets are a little over the top, and there's at least one character design that just doesn't fit with the rest of the game. I mean, it really looks out of place. And whether or not you use the texture mods created by the community, there are some textures in the game that could afford to look a lot better. It's not a big issue, but I do have to admit it's not all up to the same level. But I do have some complaints, of course. We've already covered the bad PC port issues and performance issues on all three platforms, so I won't really retread that ground. I will say though that for a game with a fairly balanced difficulty curve, it starts out pretty rough. It's not that your first boss encounter is all that difficult, it's impossible. Almost. This is a bit of a minor spoiler for the first few minutes of the game, but the first boss encounter is so nearly impossible, in fact, that you aren't even meant to fight him. That's right, you're supposed to run right by him and go through this door. You're supposed to escape, not fight. The problem I had is that I never even noticed that small doorway since I was so focused on the boss. When the boss strikes, it creates large smoke clouds, making it even more difficult to actually see the door in the heat of battle. Like many people, I kept throwing myself against this boss over and over, trying everything I could think of. I tried using items from my inventory, looking around the room, examining the hallway leading up to the boss chamber. I couldn't find any way to defeat him. I'd heard the game was difficult, so I started feeling frustrated, thinking the game was just this unreasonably difficult. Eventually, I stumbled upon the door, somehow having missed it the numerous times before. Honestly, I don't think this was the best way to introduce the player to the first boss encounter. More than a few players were confused and frustrated by this. Once you do finally defeat the first boss and escape the asylum, the game gives you little direction, and it's way too easy to be lost and confused. Where do I go? What am I supposed to do? If you wander into the wrong area, you can be decimated in a matter of seconds. But hey, at least that's a clear indicator that you're probably not supposed to go that way. Maybe I should try another path. Okay, let's not go that way either. Ah, here we go. This feels right. As for the combat itself, there's even more variety than Demon Souls. You're now able to perform a plunge attack, attacking downward when you fall on top of an enemy. That's pretty cool, but the biggest change by far is probably the poise system. Poise in Dark Souls serves as your resistance to being staggered or knocked out of your animations. The more poise you have, the harder it is for you to be staggered or stunned. With enough poise, you could even sustain a massive hit from a large weapon and not be fazed by it. With low to no poise, nearly every hit you sustain will stagger you, which means that if you are in the middle of attack animation, it will knock you out of it. It's also possible to get stun locked by several hits in a row if your poise is low enough, and when this happens, it feels really cheap. Poise is included on some armor pieces as well as a special ring. In general, the heavier the armor set, the more poise you get. Thanks to the poise mechanic, heavy armor is far more useful in Dark Souls than it was in Demon Souls, where your armor didn't affect whether you were staggered or not. With high poise armor, you can often just spam your weapon attack right through an enemy's attack. In player versus player combat, this is considered really cheap, and some people will get mad at you for doing it. And speaking of people getting mad at you in PvP, Dark Souls enjoyed a massive PvP community, even up to this day. Unfortunately, the community was, and to a certain extent still is, tainted by a number of players who insist that you must limit your character's actions and gear based on an arbitrary set of rules. Some players would insist that you cannot try to backstab your opponent, nor can you wear super heavy armor and attack with your weapon multiple times in a row, stunning your opponent. Some players will insist that it's not okay to wear certain gear or use certain spells when fighting other players, or that you must do the bow gesture before you fight a player. Many players would judge you harshly and often send unkind messages to you if you used your Estus during player versus player battles. Ultimately, however, it's up to you how you play the game. From Software built the game to be what it is, so play it for what it is if that's your thing. Don't let anyone else judge you for it. And as for judging, I'm going to tell you something that you may not believe. When I level up my characters, I typically don't bother with vitality very much, especially during the earlier parts of the game. I level up endurance a lot more than I do vitality, sometimes making it to near in-game with hardly any points invested in my health. This sometimes causes my stamina bar to actually exceed my health bar. People actually get mad at me for this. I'm not joking. I've actually gotten hate mail and complaints on my videos talking about my stamina bar being longer than my health bar. People tell me that it's wrong, and they genuinely seemed bothered by it. Go figure. And as for the PvP, it's pretty darn good. It has its problems, however. It's often hard to connect to other players, and some players would forcibly disconnect from the servers when you invaded them, knocking you back to your own world. Even when you did connect, the peer-to-peer connection would be extremely sensitive to network connection quality. Even a small amount of latency or packet loss could cause you to experience horrible lag, often producing a distinct advantage for one player over another. In many cases, due to the speed at which you can achieve a backstab, it would look like your opponent suddenly teleported behind you to backstab you, as if you were suddenly sucked into the backstab that you couldn't see coming. It feels and looks really cheap, and many players made the mistake of blaming their opponent for it, not realizing that it's a connection lag issue. This was called the lag stab, and it generated a host of hate-filled messages between players. There were also phantom hits where you would appear to hit a player, and it would make the sound like you hit the player, but it wouldn't do any damage and it wouldn't stagger them. It's as if you didn't hit them, even though it made the sound like you did. Basically, connection issues related to the peer-to-peer connections cause a variety of lag-induced problems that significantly detract from the experience. It's not always bad, but when it is, it's really bad. How you choose to respond to these connection issues is up to you, but in my opinion, it's not worth getting worked up over. Don't let it ruin your day or spoil your fun. Just take it all in stride. Internet latency is a fact of life, so what are you gonna do? And trust me, Demon Souls was even worse. Another issue I have with the Souls games, and particularly Dark Souls, is that enemies will often hit you right through solid objects like walls. If you watch my Demon Souls review when I was showing the battle with the Adjudicator, I got hit several times through solid floors and walls by an attack I couldn't even see. That's cheap, and it happens in Dark Souls sometimes too. The even bigger problem is when a solid object interferes with your attacks. In most cases, striking a wall with your weapon will cause your attack to bounce off, generally stopping the attack from hitting its target. While this makes sense, it's a serious pain in the neck because it doesn't affect the enemies. So when you're caught in a tight space, your attacks will keep bouncing off the walls while the enemies around you are wailing on you completely free of obstruction. Their attacks just phase right through everything unhindered. That's not cool, and it feels really unfair when it happens, especially if you die because of it. When you do die, it's generally your fault, but occasionally it feels like the game cheated. And speaking of the game cheating, there is the infamous Bed of Chaos boss battle. This encounter is so cheap, even the game developer admits it's a terrible design. They literally apologized for it, and they should. It's absolutely terrible. Not only does the floor start falling out underneath you, but when you get hit, your character will seem to just get sucked into the chasm regardless of how you were hit. It doesn't make any sense when you're hit by an attack coming from right to left, and your character gets knocked to the right. That's exactly the opposite of how it's supposed to work. I hate the Bed of Chaos fight, and I'm not alone in this. If you hate the Bed of Chaos fight too, donate to my Patreon account. Okay, I'm sorry, that was a lame attempt to get money. I apologize. But still, I do have a Patreon account, and there's a link in the description for it. if you're interested. Anyway, the consumable humanity resource in Dark Souls is pretty cool, and I like how it works. It's not the same as the Stone of Ephemeral Eyes from Demon Souls, but it's roughly the equivalent. Both items restore you to your body or human form, and both restore your health when you use them. In Demon Souls, these items are so rare that you can't really use them as a healing consumable. That would be a waste. In Dark Souls, that's not the case. Humanity is way too common in my opinion. You can fairly easily get 99 of them. In this way, many people will use them for the healing effect, particularly when they're invading another player where their Estus is made unavailable. I think humanity should have been far more rare, increasing its value. But this would make for less co-op in general, since you need humanity to summon other players, so that would be bad? I don't know what's the best balance for humanity. There are a few little issues with the game that From Software just refuses to fix. When you create your character, you name yourself, choose from a list of classes, and choose your appearance. You can also pick a starting gift. Among them is this one, the Tiny Beans Ring. The description says that it restores HP over time, but that's wrong. It gives you a little bit of additional HP in total. The description has always been wrong, and despite a few patches and a DLC package, From Software refuses to change the description. I just find that really odd. Also, some enemies will occasionally fall through the floor after you kill them, making it impossible to pick up any items that they may have had on them. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's annoying and it pulls you out of the experience. It looks really silly too. But of course, it never actually happened to me when I was trying to get it to, because the game knew I was recording it for that. And on the topic of little annoyances, the game features a kick move that you can do by pressing forward on the analog stick and the R1 button simultaneously. The kick can sometimes be useful for breaking an enemy's guard, but anytime I find myself kicking, it's always by mistake. I meant to do just a regular R1 attack. I find this happens way too much, and it's been an issue in all 3 Souls games for me. And let's keep going with these minor annoyances, shall we? You see, when you find a consumable item for the first time, the game will automatically put it in one of your quick slot bar slots if you have one available. I'm not really sure why, but I find this incredibly frustrating. I put items in these slots as I need them, and I would prefer the game not to do it for me. But far worse than that is the input bug. If you hit a button multiple times in a row, trying to make sure that you perform the action as soon as your previous animation ends, then you will occasionally run into a situation where the game seems to queue up a second input, and then perform it after you intended it to happen. This is especially common when holding up your shield and hitting R1 multiple times. You'll let your shield down, and suddenly, without any additional input, your character does one more R1. This bug has killed me multiple times, and it's never been addressed. I should clarify, however, that for the most part, everything works as intended, and the controls are generally very precise and accurate. In general, I love how the game handles, at least with a gamepad. I really discourage you from using the mouse and keyboard route. Trust me guys, get a gamepad. When it's all said and done, the world of Lordran, its characters, the demons, and the hollows you encounter, all of it fits together wonderfully to make one of the most masterfully crafted video game experiences I've ever had. I cannot recommend Dark Souls enough, especially if you enjoy third-person action RPGs. It is a must-play title in the genre, and its presence on all 3 major platforms leaves you no excuse not to give it a try. If you haven't played Dark Souls yet, stop what you're doing right now and get this game. I doubt you'll be disappointed. Be careful though, you might just find that it changes the way you look at video games for the rest of your life. But what did you think of Dark Souls, and how does it compare to Demon Souls? If you liked the video, hit the like button, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure to check the video description for links to my Twitter, Facebook, Let's Play channel, Twitch, and all that other garbage. I'm Fox with Foxio Games, and I'll see you next time.